Order, please. We'll begin the day routine presenting reading petitions. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a petition on behalf of the residents of Abbey Road. The operative phrase are, who are petitioning to have all construction-type vehicles banned from traveling Abbey Road and Halliburton Heights until such time as Abbey Road is paved. Further, we are petitioning to have appropriate signage erected at both ends of the unpaved Abbey Road designated with this ban. There are 40 names on this signature, Mr. Speaker, and I have affixed my signature.
Petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report that the striking committee has met to appoint members to the, or accept nominations for the committees, standing committees of the House, and I'm pleased to table them at this time. And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that each House Leader distribute to their members the individual lists, so in case there are changes before this gets into Hanford, they can be made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Report is tabled. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table the report of the Black Implementation Review Committee, September 2003. And Mr. Speaker, with your approbation, I'd like to make an introduction at this time. In the gallery opposite, Mr. Speaker, are a number of people who were involved in putting this report together, and I would ask them to rise and receive the greeting of the House. First of all, Frank Bartow, Ed Davis, Brian Forbes, Patrick Columba, Charles Shepard, Jackie Farrell Lawrence, Mike Sweeney, Sheila Lucas Cole, and Dwayne Provo. And I would like to welcome you to the House and thank you very, very much for the excellent work that you did in putting this report together.
Certainly welcome our guests to the gallery today, and the report is tabled. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since last session, the HMCS Iroquois and HMCS Fredericton have returned home after a tour of duty as part of Operation Apollo, Canada's military contribution to the international campaign against terrorism. And whereas, as part of these contributions, the Iroquois' 280 and Fredericton's 240 crew members patrolled the Gulf of Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, and the southern Arabian Gulf, identifying over 1,000 suspicious vessels and boarding dozens of suspect ships. And whereas Canadians respect the work of all our service personnel and are therefore always grateful for their safe return, therefore be it resolved that members of this House salute the crews of HMCS Iroquois and HMCS Fredericton for their roles in Operation Apollo and thank them for their honourable service to their country, and I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier.
Before reading my resolution, may I introduce a special guest in your gallery? We have with us today someone that really now needs no introduction. We actually have two people that need no introduction. With us in the gallery today are Mr. Gary Beals, who has been such a pride to Nova Scotians as a result of his tremendous success on Canadian Idol. And Mr. Beals is accompanied by another person well known to this House, Mr. David Hensby. And I would ask our guests to rise. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas over the summer months, CTV's reality television show Canadian Idol took over the airwaves, capturing the attention of our country and showcasing our talented young people. And whereas through an audition process involving 8 major cities across Canada, thousands of young people were whittled down to 2, one of whom was Cherrybrook's own 20-year-old Gary Beals. And whereas, although Mr. Beals came second in the show's grand finale, he captured the hearts of Nova Scotians with his soulful R&B sound. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Gary Beals on his fantastic result on Canadian Idol and applaud him for the phenomenal job he did as ambassador for Nova Scotia over the course of the CTV program, and I request waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Certainly want to welcome our special guest to gallery today, and I hear some of my peers asking if maybe we might be a little tuned this morning for us to start us off on a Friday morning. Anyway, and not from the gentleman on the right. Congratulations, Mr. Beal, on behalf of all the members in the legislature. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was concerned you were going to ask Mr. Hensby to sing. That would have been bad. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1994, the Black Learners Advisory Committee completed a thorough review of the status of education of African Nova Scotians and made 46 individual recommendations to improve equal opportunity in education for African Nova Scotians. And whereas since that time, the Department of Education and others have been working to ensure Nova Scotia's cultural diversity is reflected in our education system. And whereas the Minister of Education today tabled the report of the Black Report Implementation Review Committee, which indicates how far we've come and what we need to do to fully address the issues of equity raised in the Black Report. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the fine work of the members of the Black Implementation Review Committee in promoting equal opportunity in education for all Nova Scotians and join together in thanking them for their efforts. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass to the debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 10th annual Ernst & Young Atlantic Entrepreneur of the Year Award finalists were announced last evening in Halifax, and whereas the Ernst & Young Awards honor entrepreneurs who have demonstrated excellence and extraordinary success in areas such as innovation, financial performance, and personal commitment to their business and communities, whereas 6 Nova Scotians were among the nominated finalists, the 6 program categories. First, George Nusky of GNS Plastics Company Limited of Chester, Jeremy Wellard of HB Studios Multimedia Limited in Lunenburg, Peter Kohler of Kohler International Limited in DeBert, John Davis of Eco Nova Scotia Group in Halifax, as well as Paul LeBlanc of Extreme Group in Dartmouth, and David Richard of PV Inspection Services Limited in Dartmouth. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate the nominees and the award winners in this year's Ernst & Young Atlantic Canada Entrepreneur of the Year program. And Mr. Speaker, I respectfully request waiver of notice.
Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister for Health Promotion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a total of 15 runners from Run Nova Scotia have been selected to participate in the Canadian Road Race Championships in Fredericton on Sunday. And whereas Pete Quinn of Wolfville and Sienna Decker of Halifax, as a result of winning the Navy 10K run in Halifax in August, will lead the Nova Scotia team as provincial champions. And whereas other Nova Scotia team members are Anna McPherson, Pam Curriere, Louise Leduc, Alice Patrick, Emily McDonald, Daniel Freeman, Noel Payne, Dave Arnold, Ray Moorhead, Dave Nevitt, Stacey Caswell, and David and Arnold Robertson. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs in this House of Assembly salute the Run Nova Scotia team for the determination and stamina in reaching the 2003 Canadian Road Race Championships. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Government House Leader.
I Yes, Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Laws Respecting Automobile Insurance.
The Honourable Government House Leader begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Laws Respecting Automobile Insurance.
Bill number 1, an act to amend the laws respecting automobile insurance.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 402 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act, and Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Labor Standards Code.
The Honourable Minister of Justice begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 402 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act, and Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Labor Standards Code.
Bill number 2, an act to amend Chapter 402 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act, and Chapter 1246 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Labor Standards Code.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Leader of the Opposition, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 203 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Homes for Special Care Act, to ensure the fair treatment of residents of a nursing home or home for the aged or disabled.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 203 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Homes for Special Care Act, to ensure the fair treatment of residents of a nursing home or home for the aged or disabled.
Bill number 3, an act to amend Chapter 203 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Homes for Special Care Act, to ensure the fair treatment of residents of a nursing home or home for the aged or disabled.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Leader of the Opposition, the Member for Cole Harbour, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Ensure the Lowest and Fairest Rates for Automobile Insurance through the Establishment of a Public Automobile Insurance Corporation.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Ensure the Lowest and Fairest Rates for Automobile Insurance through the Establishment of a Public Automobile Insurance Corporation.
Bill number 4, an act to ensure the lowest and fairest rates for automobile insurance through the establishment of a public automobile insurance corporation.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act entitled An Act to Provide for the Elimination of the Provincial Harmonized Sales Tax on Family Essentials.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Elimination of the Provincial Harmonized Sales Tax on Family Essentials.
Bill number 5, an act to provide for the elimination of the provincial harmonized sales tax on family essentials.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 15-year-old hockey player and Cole Harbour resident Sidney Crosby was selected first overall in the 2003 Quebec Major Junior Hockey League and now plays for the Rimouski Oceanic. And whereas this young man's extraordinary hockey talent has been internationally recognized, with even Wayne Gretzky picking him to be the next great one. And whereas in his first 4 games in the QMJHL, Sydney scored 5 goals and 4 assists and was named the league's Offensive Player of the Week. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulates Sidney Crosby for what he has achieved at such a young age and send him along our best wishes for what is likely to be a long, successful hockey career that we will all enjoy watching. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this evening, women and children will gather at the Grand Parade for the annual Take Back the Night rally and march in Halifax. And whereas this annual rally and march draws to the attention of all Nova Scotians that personal safety for women and their children in cities and towns across our province is a serious issue. And whereas the most recent provincial statistics show that 8 times as many women as men stay home at night because they are afraid to go out alone, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House extend our best wishes to the organizers of the annual Take Back the Night rally and march and pledge our commitment to ensuring that adequate violence prevention programs and supports are available whenever and wherever they may be needed. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the St. Margaret's Sailing Club hosted the 2003 Canadian Laser Class Sailing Championships this summer, and whereas since being formed in 1956, the St. Margaret's Sailing Club has a rich culture in junior sailing, and whereas Nova Scotia sailors did exceptionally well during the national event at the St. Margaret's Club, winning medals that included a gold by Mark Campbell in the Canadian Laser Radio competition. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs recognize the tremendous work in organizing a national event of this stature and commend all the volunteers and competitors who had such a great time at St. Margaret's Sailing Club in July.
Agreed.
Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bryony House, a transition house for women and children fleeing abuse, was the first service of its kind in Nova Scotia, and whereas Bryony House opened its doors in 1979 following many months of planning and hard organizational work by women and men who saw the need to respond to violence against women. And whereas Bryony House is marking its 25th year of operation this year, therefore be it resolved that members of the Nova Scotia Legislature extend our sincere appreciation to the many Bryony House workers and volunteers through whose hard work and dedication thousands have found safety and an opportunity for a life free of violence. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the newly minted Minister of Human Resources recently said that she admires the Premier for, quote, bringing government to where it is today. And whereas, stay tuned. And whereas thanks to the Premier, his majority has been turned into a minority, despite the victory of the member from Lunenburg West, and whereas by using the Minister's logic, the Premier can be thanked for a new era of deficit financing, higher unemployment, and a stalled offshore oil and gas industry. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Human Resources be congratulated for placing the blame of government failures directly at the foot of the Premier where it belongs. I'd ask for a waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? I hear several noes. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ken Margison, 92 years young, has recently been honored by local scouting officials for his incredible 80 years of involvement with the organization beginning in the 1920s when he was a child. And whereas Brian Johnson presented him with a silver pin, which was made especially for Mr. Margison's 80 years of service, and a hand-carved plaque depicting the Scout Tree Canada crest, a program which he was instrumental in starting in Nova Scotia. And whereas Mr. Margison, a recipient of the highest award given to Scout volunteers, the Silver Wolf, names Meeting Scout founder Lord Robert Baden-Powell as one of his lifetime highlights. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank Ken Margison for his dedicated involvement with the Scouting movement for 80 years and congratulate him on receiving all the accolades that he has over the course of his Scout involvement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the new Liberal education critic raised an important issue in the media this week regarding school fees. Whereas this caucus orientation obviously didn't include a historical lesson on the actions of the previous Liberal government, whose education cuts forced the introduction of most of these fees. Whereas it's not surprising that the member for Kings West's new caucus colleagues are anxious to forget about their past education record, which was based on cuts and signing sweet P3 deals with their Liberal friends. Therefore, be it resolved that this House welcomes the new member for Kings West and advises him to look before he leaps at future media opportunities. I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Agreed.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here or no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1999, the current Premier announced that by year 2 of his mandate, all taxes raised through licensing and fuel sales would be dedicated to highway construction and maintenance. And whereas this commitment has never been fulfilled and constantly ignored since the 1999 election, and whereas the Premier proclaimed in his Blue Book 1, entitled Strong Leadership, Clear Course, that this promise was, quote, not a cynical attempt to buy your vote, unquote. Therefore, be it resolved that our lame duck Premier explain the merits of his commitment and when his government intends to live up to his Blue Book promise outlined on page 42 of his report.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Eastern Shore.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas International Literacy Day is celebrated each September the 8th and provides a perfect background to recognize the dedicated efforts of literacy advocates and volunteers across the province. And whereas the Nova Scotia School for Adult Learning Community Literacy Volunteer Awards were created to honor 4 volunteers who make the community-based adult literacy programs they work with a success, and this year Heather Croak has been so chosen. And whereas Ms. Croak, who joined the Dartmouth Literacy Network in 1994 as a learner to enhance her own reading, writing, and math skills, earned tutor status in 1999, and in turn helped others reach their goals while serving on the network's board of directors, helping coordinate events and fundraising activities, and assisting the network's office several times a week. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House applaud Heather Croak for her personal achievements and for her commitment to the Dartmouth Literacy Network and adult learning. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member of Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas coal mining has always been a dangerous and perilous occupation, and whereas this industry has taken the lives of many workers before their time and before they could collect a pension, and whereas the Cape Breton Development Corporation has decided not to give excess pension funds back to the widows and pensioners that rightly deserve them. Therefore, be it resolved that this House condemn the Board of Directors of the Cape Breton Development Corporation and anyone else who had a hand in refusing the widows and pensioners their rightful access to those funds that they own and deserve. I seek waiver.
Request for waiver. I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas congratulations go out to all those involved in completing the new sports field at the Mainland Common in Clayton Park, and whereas the $2.2 million field officially opened in a ceremony on Wednesday and is the largest artificial turf field of its kind in Canada, and whereas the new field is going to host 90% of the games for the upcoming Canadian Under-14 National Soccer Championships next month, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House join me in congratulating everyone who was involved in completing the new sport field at the Mainland North Common in Clayton Park. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas when you mention the game of softball in Brookfield, the name Mike Henderson automatically comes to one's mind. However, the same can't be said about golf. And whereas Mike recently won the Brookfield Golf Club Championship, defeating a young Mark Moore by 2 strokes before Mark returned to the United States on his golf scholarship, and whereas besides the Henderson-Moore duel, Brookfield and Stewiacke were evenly split in inter-club league play, with Brookfield finally winning 12.5 points to 11.5 points over their visitors from Fox Hollow and Stewiacke. Therefore be it resolved that MLAs in this House of Assembly commend Mike, Mark, Brookfield Golf Club members, and Fox Hollow owners Ron and Betty Gorley for another great season of golf in South Colchester County. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas beef, sheep, and dairy producers have been waiting for a clear signal from this government that it is committed to helping with real dollars, and whereas for months the talk from the government has been good, but the delivery of support has been poor, and whereas this government hasn't learned what all farmers know, that you can't starve a profit out of anything. Therefore, be it resolved that this government show its real commitment to agriculture and offer immediately a program of dollars that will save suffering farmers from a crisis that was not of their making. And I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sister Dorothy Moore of Member 2 is being one of 5 Nova Scotians to receive the 2003 Order of Nova Scotia, and whereas the Order of Nova Scotia is our province's highest honor, and whereas Sister Dorothy Moore is an educational leader who has devoted many years to the preservation and restoration of the Mi'kmaq language and culture. Therefore, it be resolved that all members in this House congratulate Sister Dorothy Moore for receiving this year's 2003 Order of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver, please.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas International Literacy Day is celebrated each September 8th, provides a perfect background to recognize the dedicated efforts of literacy advocates and volunteers across the province. Whereas the Nova Scotia School for Adult Learning Community Literacy Volunteer Awards were created to honor 4 volunteers who make the community-based adult literacy programs they work with a success, and this year, Shirley McNamara of Cleveland has been chosen. And whereas Shirley McNamara, a founding member of the Richmond County Literacy Network, has been a major force in the network's growth in both staff numbers and the selection programs offered, serving as chairperson for 2 terms, and providing unwavering support to staff initiatives and professional development. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House commend Shirley McNamara for championing literacy in Richmond County, helping to establish the Richmond County Literacy Network, success in adult literacy and upgrading. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the families of Nova Scotia deserve a safe and healthy environment for themselves and the future generations, and our children deserve to breathe in the cleanest air possible, and whereas at present our children are breathing in toxic chemicals every day due to polluting facilities all across the province, and whereas we do have the technology available to use to generate more efficient clean energy, such as wind and solar power, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia government lead the way to a cleaner, safer future for ourselves and our children by becoming a world leader in clean energy production. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Sunday, September 28, 2003, Halifax will join Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, and Kitchener in a national celebration of literacy and the printed word when Pier 20 plays host to the 9th annual Word on the Street Book and Magazine Fair. And whereas the Word on the Street Book and Magazine Fair showcases many talented Nova Scotia authors and entertainers in a fun-filled day for the entire family. And whereas the Word on the Street highlights the pleasure of great reading through the excitement of great writing, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House extend our best wishes to the organizers, volunteers, and all participants who have and will work tirelessly to make the 9th Annual Word on the Street Book and Magazine Fair in Halifax a success. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the town of Lunenburg officially opened a state-of-the-art wastewater treatment facility on September 12, 2003, with total assistance from this provincial government in the amount of $2,524,266. And whereas the town of Lunenburg has been working toward the completion of such a facility since the mid-1960s. And whereas this wastewater treatment facility will ensure that local residents and visitors to one of only 2 urban UNESCO World Heritage Sites in North America will enjoy a harbor like that which the settlers to Lunenburg would have enjoyed when they arrived in 1753. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulates the Mayor and Councillors and the people of Lunenburg on the completion of this tremendous project. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Captain William Spry Lodge on Arnold Drive in Spryfield was built by the Nova Scotia Housing Commission in 1980, opening in August 81, for the express purpose of housing senior citizens. And whereas although an elevator shaft is marked in the blueprints of the 2-story lodge, no elevator has yet been installed, causing great hardship to many residents over the past 22 years and forcing others to move or to go into nursing home care. And whereas the pleas of the 40 residents of the lodge have failed to persuade successive governments to complete the lodge by installing the elevator which would enable them to reach the upper story. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House urge the Minister of Community Services to ensure that the Captain William Spry Lodge is completed within the next year by installing the elevator as shown in the original blueprints. I hereby request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas September 28 is National Day set aside to commemorate National Peace and Police Officers Memorial Day to show respect for peace and police officers. Whereas this day of recognition is a fitting way to remember the brave men and women who have lost their lives while helping to keep our country, province, cities, and towns safe. Whereas this National Day draws to the attention of all Nova Scotians the significant personal risks that all peace officers encounter daily as they selflessly contribute to preserve law and order in our society. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House pause for a moment of silence to remember those men and women who have lost their lives while protecting ours and express appreciation for the dedication of all peace and police officers that help keep us safe in our communities. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. I ask all members to rise and join me in one moment of silence. Thank you. Please be seated. Gentleman, Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Carl Upham, the town of Troro's deputy clerk, retired after 40 years of continuous employment, and whereas Carl Upham provided distinguished service to the town of Truro as the deputy clerk and always so as a member of the engineering department, and whereas Carl Upham's ability to bring common sense to complex issues, his ability to bring calm when dealing with irate taxpayers, and his corporate memory will be difficult to replace. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate and thank Carl Upham for his 40 years of exemplary employment with the town of Truro, and wish him and his wife Gloria all the best in their retirement years. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice, and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Northumberland Regional High School in Alma, Pictou County, has officially opened this month, and whereas students in grades 9 to 12 are attending who formerly received their high school education at West Pictou District High, Westville High, and Stellarton High, and whereas Northumberland Regional is designated to serve the educational needs of high school students in the Pictou West area for decades to come. Therefore, it be resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature wish every success to Principal Preston Lockhart, to the teachers and other staff, and to the more than 1,200 students who are attending. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Saturday, September 27th, the Archibald Field in Sydney will be the site for the first annual Walk to Defeat ALS in Cape Breton. And whereas ALS, better known as Lou Gehrig's disease, is a rapidly progressing fatal neuromuscular disease that impacts between 1,500 and 2,000 Canadians. And whereas monies raised from the Walk to Defeat ALS will be used to fund local services and nationally directed research programs. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Mr. Gary Smith of Glace Bay for organizing the first annual Walk to Defeat ALS and extend our best wishes for a successful event. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Andrew Charles, who sails out of the Bedford Basin Yacht Club, defeated 118 other sailors in August to win the U.S. National Laser Sailing Championship, and where Andrew has been a member of the Canadian national sailing team for the past 2 years, while also training this past spring and summer in Europe for the 2004 Olympic trials, and whereas Andrew will join Halifax's Trevor Hamilton and Charlottetown's Andrew Lee in the upcoming World Sailing Championships in Cadiz, Spain. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly applaud the efforts of Andrew Charles from the Bedford Basin Yacht Club and wish him every possible success in the continued training for the 2004 Olympic trials as well as the 2003 World Sailing Championships. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas September is Big Brothers Big Sisters Month in Canada, and whereas Big Brothers Big Sisters, including the one in Dartmouth, are helping to shape the future of children and young adults, and whereas these agencies owe their success to many dedicated volunteers, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Big Brothers Big Sisters and its many volunteers for a job well done and encourage all Nova Scotians to consider volunteering for this worthy organization. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas congratulations goes out to Gary Beals, a pride of Cherrybrook, Nova Scotia. And whereas Gary is a gentleman and a class act at this year's Canadian Idol, as he represented the community of Cherrybrook and indeed all the people of Nova Scotia. And whereas all Nova Scotians will be looking forward to watching his rising star, great future, as he moves onward in his future endeavours. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House congratulate Cherrybrook resident Gary Beals on his outstanding success at Canadian Idol and wish him the very best in the future. Would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Laura Harris, Nova Scotia's female golfing sensation from the Kenwo Golf and Country Club in New Minas, won her first Nova Scotia Junior Ladies Golf Championship this summer at River Hills Golf and Country Club in Clyde River, Shelburne County. And whereas Laura's final round score of 79 was 10 shots better than her nearest competitors, as was her tournament score of 232, and whereas with the win, Laura advanced to the Canadian National Junior Ladies Golf Championship outside of Quebec City in August, where she finished in a tie for 10th place, only 3 strokes back of the eventual Canadian champion. Therefore, be it resolved, members of this Legislative Assembly recognize the significant achievements of one Laura Harris from Kenwo and wish her many more successful years on the golf course. And Mr. Speaker, I would further guess that Laura is about 14, meaning she has many years of eligibility left, and I would request waiver.
Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dawn and Devonna Edwards have recently authored a history of the Armdale and Fairview communities in Halifax West, and whereas the book entitled The Little Dutch Village and published by Nimbus is the first time these communities' histories have been collected and told in one place, and whereas every Nova Scotia community deserves to have its history told and celebrated, therefore be it resolved that this House congratulates Dawn and Devonna Edwards and Nimbus Publishing on the publication of The Little Dutch Village and wishes them healthy sales and wide readership. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mark Pyle from Blackrock attended the Swim Club National Championships, and whereas this national championship was held in Calgary, Alberta this past summer, and whereas Mark won 1 gold, 2 silver, and 2 bronze medals at these championships. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Mark Pyle for his excellent achievements at the Swim Club National Championships held this past summer in Calgary. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Now, member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas those from away have helped create the fabric of Nova Scotia by being the new threads so integral to this fabric. And whereas the descendants of Andrew and Edith McDonnell joined for a reunion this past August, and whereas such events are never a success without the efforts of supreme organizational talents. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulates Susan McDonnell for her organizational skill and all of the descendants of Andrew and Edith McDonnell for recognizing the value of family. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Emily Stanley of Truro won the Walter H. Johnson Jr. Gold Award Scholarship from the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia. And whereas Emily Stanley graduated from Cobequid Education Centre in 2003, then worked as a summer student at the Truro Tourist Bureau. And whereas Emily Stanley has entered Mount St. Vincent University's Bachelor Program in Tourism and Hospitality. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Emily Stanley on winning the prestigious Walter H. Johnson Jr. Gold Award Scholarship and wish her every success in her studies in tourism and hospitality management. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce the following resolution. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1998, the Halifax Regional School Board launched the Golden Apple Awards to recognize community members who have made outstanding contributions towards the success of their school community. And whereas in June of this year, Patricia Lewis received a Golden Apple Award in recognition of the many years of volunteering at Westmount School as the initiator of the Safe Arrival Program, as a member of the School Advisory Council, as a member of the Westmount School Association and the School Discipline Committee. Whereas Patricia Lewis also volunteers in the organization of fundraising events and assists with school trips. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Patricia Lewis in receiving the Golden Apple Award and extend our thanks to the many volunteers in school communities who offer so much of their time for the benefit of the students of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bounty Bay Shellfish and 5M Aquafarms Limited is proposing a large blue mussel farm at St. Anne's Bay, Victoria County, which could employ up to 50 people. And whereas this farm and processing plant will provide economic development and jobs for the people in rural Nova Scotia. And whereas the project has gone through a 2-year public and government review process. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House support economic development and jobs in rural Cape Breton by endorsing the development of the Bounty Bay Shellfish and 5M Aquafarms Incorporated Mussel Farm. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas legendary couple Francis and Clary Coolin will celebrate 60 years of marriage on October 9th, and whereas the Coolins' renewal of their marriage vows will take place in Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church in Prospect, whereas Francis and Clary continue to serve as a wonderful example of dedication and involvement for all of us. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Clary and Francis Coolin on their 60th wedding anniversary with best wishes of a great future in the years ahead. I ask for waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary holds regional search and rescue techniques competitions annually, and whereas this year's Atlantic Region competition was hosted in Halifax from September 19th to September 21st, and whereas our own Nova Scotia team were the eventual winners of the Atlantic Regional competitions and will now move on to represent Nova Scotia at the International Search and Rescue Competition at Portsmouth, Virginia in November of 2004. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House extend their heartiest congratulations and most sincere wishes for the best of luck and continued success at Virginia in 2004. Mr. Speaker, I ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sackville Centennial School in Lower Sackville has been actively participating in a program which promotes health and safety for their children, and whereas the Wednesday, October 8, 2003 is International Walk to School Day, and whereas Sackville Centennial School is kicking off the national program Active and Safe Routes to School by having a walk around the block with their students, staff, and community members. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Sackville Centennial School as it promotes a healthy and safe environment for the children of our province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Oh, good job. Waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this weekend in Lawrencetown, Annapolis County will mark the 90th anniversary of 4-H in Canada and will feature more than 40 projects. And whereas 3,400 members and leaders will gather in the Annapolis Valley Exhibition Grounds to showcase their talent at the annual event. And whereas the 4-H program is the largest youth organization in the world with 7 million members worldwide and clubs in more than 80 countries. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the 4-H program on its 90th anniversary and wish them the greatest success on the weekend at this year's showcase. Mr. Speaker, I ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the St. Mary's Polish Church in Whitney Pier is the only Polish church built in Atlantic Canada. And whereas the St. Mary's Polish Church has been serving the spiritual and cultural needs of the Catholics of Polish and Slavic heritage in industrial Cape Breton for over 90 years. And whereas the celebrations of that anniversary were held on September the 6th of this year. Therefore, it be resolved that this House congratulate the St. Mary's Polish Church for their vital role it has played in the lives of its parishioners and the entire community of Whitney Pier. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West. Sorry, Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very content with Cape Breton West. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's youth are the most important resource for the future of our province. And whereas since being elected in 1999, the John Hem government has failed Nova Scotia's youth by allowing the cost of post-secondary studies at universities and community colleges to spiral out of control. And whereas because Nova Scotia has now the highest tuition fees in Canada, many youth are being forced to leave Nova Scotia to complete their education and seek employment elsewhere. Therefore, be it resolved, the provincial government establish a comprehensive youth education and employment strategy that will reverse the brain drain from Nova Scotia and protect its most valuable resource. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver? I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a week ago, Excellence in Action was held in Halifax to honor our Paralympians, and whereas 5 Nova Scotia's Paralympians were presented with the Hall of Excellence Awards, including 3 athletes from Dartmouth, and whereas Nova Scotia's Paralympians serve as a fine example to all citizens of the value of hard work, determination, and the desire to rise above obstacles. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulates Susan McLeod of Halifax, Barry Patrickin of Oxford, and John McPherson, Julia Dalesley, and Lionel Simpson of Dartmouth on a job well done. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cape Breton Growth Fund Corporation and Member 2 are hosting a sod turning ceremony for the Member 2 Trade and Commerce Society today, September 26, 2003. And whereas this world-class meeting and convention center is scheduled to open its doors to the world in the spring of 2004, and whereas once again this center is another shining example of the great initiatives undertaken by the residents of Member 2. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Member 2 and the Cape Breton Growth Fund on working together towards their new Trade and Commerce Center. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the sport of baseball is known as a great team sport with goals of individual character building, team discipline, and leadership development skills. And whereas Sean Bennett led a vigorous and well-run NDP campaign team to a strong second-place finish in the recent provincial election in Hants West. And whereas Sean Bennett also found time and energy to help his team, the Hantsport Shamrocks, win the Nova Scotia and Atlantic Intermediate Baseball Championships Therefore, be it resolved, this House congratulates Sean Bennett, his teammates, and the coaches with the Hansport Shamrocks on their successful 2003 baseball season. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Barbara Cash of the Sacred Heart Ladies Group was instrumental this year in Johnstown having its most successful milling frolic to date. Whereas the Johnstown Milling Frolic has been held in the same location over the past 70 years, that being the Johnstown Parish Hall. Whereas the Milling Frolic offers residents of the surrounding area a chance to celebrate their Gaelic heritage, which is evident in many of its people. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Barbara Cash and all of the parishioners of Sacred Heart for hosting the most successful milling frolic to date in its long-standing history. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas transition house workers at Autumn House in Amherst have been on strike since August the 11th, and whereas at the heart of this dispute is inadequate funding from the Department of Community Services, which does not fully fund programs offered at any of the transition houses throughout Nova Scotia. And whereas immediate action must be taken to resolve this issue and restore the critical services on which women and children in abusive situations depend. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Community Services stop hiding behind the skirts of the Autumn House Board and take responsibility for a situation that has already gone on far too long. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? Here, no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas last spring government promised lower taxes will not come at the expense of a balanced budget. And whereas the government also promised that lower taxes will not come at the expense of better health care, better education, and better roads. And whereas the government promised lower taxes will lead to better health care for all, a better education for our children, and better roads for everyone. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House remind Nova Scotians of the government commitment that lower taxes will not come at the expense of vital services. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? Here, no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas New Waterford has always been known for its great baseball teams going as far back as the colliery leagues of the 1930s and the 1940s, and whereas that tradition is very much alive and well today in our young players. And whereas this is shown to be true when the teams from New Waterford won the Nova Scotia Mosquito, Bantam, and Midget titles in their respective divisions. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate the players, coaches, executive, and all the volunteers for keeping New Waterford as one of the top baseball towns in this province. I seek waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2003-2004 fiscal year business planning process for the various district health authorities is still ongoing. And whereas ideally district health authorities should be planning for next fiscal year rather than being mired in trying to deal with government's mismanagement this fiscal year. And whereas the delay in government's response to the districts will no doubt result in service level reductions that could impact frontline health care. Therefore, be it resolved, the people of Nova Scotia acknowledge that any reductions in health care services will be the result of government inaction and mismanagement, not the fault of the district health authorities. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? Here or no? Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many organizations, including the East Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club, provide so many important services and opportunities for our children and youth, and whereas it is becoming increasingly harder to find appropriate facilities in which to carry out this important work, in our community, and whereas we must do everything we can to provide a safe and healthy environment in which these services are provided to our children and youth, therefore be it resolved that the Government of Nova Scotia lend a helping hand to our children by becoming a stakeholder in the future plans for Dartmouth East Community Centre. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax, Shabakto.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas continued pollution of Halifax Harbour is widely recognized as an environmental detriment and has a negative influence on tourism in the metro area. And whereas the full cost of dealing with the pollution ought to be borne by residents of HRM but supported by the federal and provincial governments, and whereas the province of Nova Scotia has indicated that it is prepared to contribute $30 million to the cost of this project, therefore be it resolved that this House asks the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations to increase the amount of this contribution and attach conditions to provincial support that result in an improved Halifax Harbour project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas small and medium construction companies rely on government tenders for much of their business, and whereas in order to ensure stability, it is important that companies can bid on road work well in advance of the construction season. And whereas this stability makes it easier to plan their employment and equipment needs in advance, therefore be it resolved that the province ensure that the bulk of the road tenders are let in the fall so that companies can plan for the spring and summer construction season. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Digby Regional High School Envirothon team placed 10th in North America at the 16th Annual Cannon Envirothon. And whereas the final contest took place this summer in Emmitsburg, Maryland, involving 41 teams, 35 from the United States and 6 from Canada. And whereas 2 teacher advisors, Greg Turner and Ann Littlewood, have spent a lot of time outside of school hours with the team studying and preparing for competitions. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Digby Regional High School Envirothon team and all those involved for their excellent showing at the 16th Annual Cannon Envirothon. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas John Yaden arrived at Nova Scotia in 1783 from Yorkshire, and having settled first at Rawdon, purchased land at Harriet's Field in 1811 and later at Spryfield, where he and his descendants farmed and quarried granite until the mid-20th century. And whereas the members of the Yaden family were buried on the farm in an area which is now part of the old Canadian Tire store parking lot on the Herring Cove Road. And whereas members of the Yaden family from across North America gathered on September 13, 2003 at the burial ground to see its commemoration and dedication as a ceremony, therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly extend its congratulations to the Yaden family and to the Mainland South Heritage Society for their extensive and detailed research leading to the dedication of the Yaden Family Cemetery. I hereby request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this fall the Halifax Forum is celebrating its 75th anniversary with a slate of special events, and whereas this week-long series of events begins on Saturday, September 27th, and includes everything from music and ice shows, public skating, hockey, and boxing. And whereas the Halifax Forum was designed by Andrew Cobb and built in 1927 at the corner of Windsor and Almond Street, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the organizers of the Halifax Forum 75th anniversary and wish them the very best over the upcoming week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver.
All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many of the secondary roads in this province are in deplorable condition, and whereas drivers are constantly paying for this neglect with expensive repairs to their vehicles, and whereas gasoline taxes were designed to pay for road maintenance and construction, therefore it be resolved that this government immediately put a higher priority on secondary roads by dedicating more of the gasoline tax for the purpose it was originally intended. I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here or no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton South. Oh, sorry. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the John Ham government cut $897,000 from the budgets of transition houses, men's treatment programs, and women's centres in the 2002 budget, and whereas the government would like the public to think it reversed the cuts after protests by angry Nova Scotians, and whereas the reality is the Tory government has not returned funding to these programs, only providing interim funding on a quarterly basis, therefore be it resolved, the John Ham government admit that they were not being factual with the public while allowing women's centres, transition houses, and men's treatment programs to remain underfunded. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of motion and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. There's several noes. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Long Lake Provincial Park in Halifax's mainland south is a natural jewel enjoyed by citizens from miles around. And whereas Long Lake has for some considerable time been enjoyed by people walking their dogs because it is one of the few areas where dogs could run off leash. And whereas the Department of Natural Resources has recently, and without advance warning to the public, decided to issue tickets for allowing dogs to run off leash. Therefore, be it resolved that the Department of Natural Resources should explain to the public the reasons for its policy reversal in Long Lake Provincial Park, give the public an opportunity to be heard, suspend the issuance of any more tickets until after the public meeting, and cancel any tickets issued before the public meeting.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Timberlake Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Prospect Bay Road is in a terrible shape of disrepair, whereas this road serves this growing area and the historic village of Prospect, whereas the deterioration of the Prospect Bay Road has resulted in dangerous driving conditions. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Transportation immediately instruct his staff to review the need for a major upgrade to the Prospect Bay Road from Whites Lake to Prospect Village.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Government of Nova Scotia has committed to replace the Cobequid Multi-Service Centre with a very much needed new facility with 24-hour access to emergency care for the residents of Sackville and surrounding communities. And whereas this project is vital to maintaining and providing the best possible health care to the residents of Nova Scotia. And whereas the only progress made on this project has been to change the name of the current facility to Cobequid Community Health Centre on July 1st, 2002. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House demand a swift completion of the new Cobequid Community Health Centre. I request waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here or no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the intersection at Kites Hill and the Sydney-Glace Bay Highway has long been known as extremely busy and dangerous crossing point for local residents, particularly children and seniors. Whereas repeated requests from local residents to install a stoplight at this intersection so pedestrians can cross safely has been ignored. And whereas on the very day we were all being sworn in as members of this assembly, a young person was struck seriously injured when struck by a car while attempting to cross at this intersection. Therefore, it be resolved that this House call upon the Minister of Transportation to protect the safety of pedestrians who cross at the Kites Hill and Sydney Glace Bay Highway intersection by immediately agreeing to have a traffic light installed at this location. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver? Hearing no, notice is tabled. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas September is Arthritis Month, and whereas 144,000 Nova Scotians suffer from this painful and debilitating disease, and whereas there are many new and effective medications that ease the pain and help delay or prevent joint damage, but they are not fully covered by pharmacare. Therefore, be it resolved that this government assure arthritis patients across the province that it will work towards a full coverage for these medications under the pharmacare program. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. No further resolutions. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call the order of business government motions?
Government motions.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the adjourned debate on the address and reply to the speech from the throne be now resumed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition, you have approximately 53 minutes.
53 minutes. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I offered some brief comments on the contents of the speech from the throne and on the challenges and opportunities that we as a legislature face as a result of the outcome of the recent election. Today, after having some time to review the speech in greater depth, I would like to make some additional comments. I will also comment on the government's agenda and the NDP's objectives for the upcoming session. In one of his essays, the American philosopher Henry David Thoreau said that a government in which the majority rule in all cases cannot be based on justice. The voters in Nova Scotia have decided that in this legislature, no political party will rule in all cases. Let us hope that this means a government that is based on justice, a government that will listen, a government that is quick to correct its mistakes. I believe the throne speech illustrates the dilemma facing this government. Nova Scotian voters returned the Conservatives to government, yet did not grant them the power to act arbitrarily. The throne speech lays out a short list of objectives for the upcoming session. The Premier makes the point that much of the power of government lies beyond the walls of this House. But the government's plans, while we are here, will now have to be adjusted to ensure the support of the House. Some will say, quite wisely, that yesterday's throne speech recognizes this reality. For example, Mr. Speaker, the government has changed its position with respect to auto insurance. Now they say that premiums will be rolled back by 20%, as put forward by the Liberals during the most recent election. Of course, Mr. Speaker, the harsh reality is that Nova Scotians have endured a 65% increase in the price of auto insurance. This is a crisis for Nova Scotia families. A 65% insurance increase in one short year is more than many family budgets can absorb. Government doesn't seem to understand this. They also don't seem to understand that beyond that number are people whose rates have doubled and tripled, or even worse. And the increases kept on. Many are still getting notices of rate increases because so many of those rate increases were filed before the government's so-called freeze took effect. Their solution is to try the same approach that has already failed miserably in New Brunswick. They have not studied, or they have not learned from the province of New Brunswick. New Brunswickers have suffered the worst increases in the cost of auto insurance of any province, despite a long history of provincial regulation that was much stricter than any in the province of Nova Scotia. The New Brunswick government promised that it would lower rates by 20% using a plan that is based on the same assumptions that were used in this province by both the Conservatives and Liberals. Many months after that promise was made, New Brunswickers were still waiting for that promised rate decrease, a decrease that would still leave them paying much higher rates, and a decrease that they would themselves finance by being forced to accept much less coverage for the injuries they suffer in automobile accidents. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, decisions of the New Brunswick Public Utilities Board illustrate the problems very well. One problem is inconsistency. The cooperators were ordered to reduce their rates by 20%. ING was ordered to reduce its rates by 11%. The rates won't be the same, even though the coverage is the same. The second problem is complexity. Customers of those companies were told by New Brunswick officials that they may or may not receive those rate decreases. It all depends on when and how their rates were last increased. It also will depend on many other factors, each factor being used uniquely by each insurance company to set its rates. Customers have no guarantee that they won't be bumped into a different rating category. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the third problem is the looming legal challenge. The courts have established legal principles that govern the conduct of regulatory bodies. The New Brunswick PUB has admitted that there is no actual evidence before it to justify the rate reductions that it's ordering. Now, Mr. Speaker, our legal system tends to be very protective of private property and of private financial interests. New Brunswick have a long legal battle hanging over their heads, and the possibility that someday down the road the Supreme Court of Canada or some other higher court may overthrow the whole idea of rate rollbacks that are not based on facts or evidence. The fourth problem with the approach taken by the New Brunswick legislature and by the other two parties in this House is that it does not challenge the inherent high administrative costs, irrational decision-making, and instability of providing a universal government-created insurance plan through private market competition by financial institutions. Good point. Evidence before the Utilities and Review Board indicated that the big insurance companies set their rates on the basis of a plan to keep and increase market share, and in the face of new competition from the chartered banks. Those companies, when they got into stock market trouble, demanded rate increases and reductions in insurance coverage to help them recover the money they spent for market share. That is how private insurance rates tend to operate, like a roller coaster. In every province where the mandatory universal auto insurance package is not provided by a public driver-owned plan. The industry itself admits that it makes a steady income and a steady profit in the public insurance provinces where private companies compete for the optional coverage that is added onto the basic plan. But in their drive for maximum profit and maximum market share, they scorn the goal of reasonable income and reasonable profit year in, year out. That is their right, Mr. Speaker. But Nova Scotians have the right to say that the private insurers must look elsewhere for their super profits and for the boom and bust ride they take with other people's money. Ignoring those problems, ignoring the clear evidence of the lowest and fairest rates, the most stable rates in public plans, this government and the Liberals want to take money away from people who are injured in car accidents and give it to insurance companies to pad their bottom lines. Now, let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, about the result of what the result of this legislation will be on the innocent victims of car accidents. They will be asked to endure the trauma of the accident and the resulting injury with only token compensation. They will be stripped of their civil right to recourse in the courts. Right. The burden of a failing system is placed, Mr. Speaker, on the backs of the consumers. Shame. Shame. The insurers, shame, through their many representatives, shame, exert their powerful influence to explain away profits that have increased by 486% over the last year. The government is not going to solve the problem of skyrocketing auto insurance rates with a steadfast, dogmatic adherence to the charade of a principle that says that what is good for the insurance industry is good for Nova Scotians. This problem needs a long-term solution. The bottom line of their plan is that Nova Scotia drivers and their families will be continuing to pay too much for auto insurance coverage that they took for granted 1 year ago. This is the plan that guarantees that the price gap and the coverage gap between us and the public auto insurance plans becomes even wider and even more unfair. And despite the government's compromise with the Liberals, the proposed legislation is simply not going to provide a solution. The system itself is broken and needs to be fundamentally reformed. Only a public auto insurance system will provide the long-term solution that Nova Scotia families need. Mr. Speaker, auto insurance is not the only issue in which the government has changed its position. No. It also seems that they have reconsidered their approach to property assessment.
We'll see.
Now, the government agrees with the NDP that the annual increases in residential assessment should be capped. Mr. Speaker, one version of an old saying is that nothing concentrates the mind like the possibility of immediate death. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats on the South Shore, where skyrocketing property assessment is the major issue, tell me that our party won 34% of the vote in the 4 constituencies that center on Lunenburg County. That very substantial NDP vote on the South Shore may have forced the government to finally pay attention to an issue that has been pursued so consistently and eloquently by my colleague from Timberley Prospects. More credit to him and to the Lunenburg NDP and to the many residents and community leaders in communities like Riverport who made sure that this issue was front and center. The government has now turned its attention to the fact that municipalities gained from the rapid increases in residential assessment in some communities because taxes skyrocketed on unimproved properties, which in some cases had been in the same families for generations. We hope that the details of the legislation will show that this government, the province, will accept their own responsibility to address the problem and not attempt, as it has in the past, to download responsibility to the municipalities. The demand for action on the property assessment issue has never been stronger. Now we will see if this government is nimble enough to respond effectively to that demand. Mr. Speaker, a new initiative noted in the throne speech is the creation of a minister responsible for African Nova Scotian affairs. While this is a positive step forward, I know that it would have meant much more to African Nova Scotians if the government had listened and responded to the many recommendations they've made to government over the last 10 years. And Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians of all races have been closely watching the Human Rights Commission hearing into the alleged discrimination against Kirk Johnson and the prospect that racial profiling exists here. The new minister will have an opportunity to show the value of his position when it is time for the government to deal with whatever is decided by the Human Rights Tribunal hearing that case. While I am glad to see the government taking action on matters such as the African Nova Scotia affairs and property assessments, I am disappointed that there are so many issues of great importance that did not even merit a mention in yesterday's speech from the throne. Mr. Speaker, issues like long-term care. Seniors in long-term care continue to be stripped of their life savings to pay for health care that everyone else receives for free. The government has told these seniors they are not a priority, that they will have to wait years for fairness. The throne speech signals the government's continued refusal to take immediate action to address this issue. This will be a great disappointment to all those seniors and their families who are affected by this policy. My friend in the third party and members opposite may be tempted to claim that we can't talk about this incredible injustice because the government is going through a massive cost-cutting exercise right now. Well, Mr. Speaker, this government has made choices that we would not have made. If another party had been elected in July, their starting point would have been the budget that has already been approved for this year. A new government might well have ordered a special audit. But, Mr. Speaker, that, of course, is pure speculation. What I do know is that the NDP intends to hold this government fully accountable for the choices it made, including the Tory choice to make a 10% income tax cut, one of the few promises they actually kept. We are choosing at the same time to keep taking while choosing at the same time to keep taking the life savings of people who required long-term care. We all agree that the budget must be balanced, but we certainly do not agree on the choices that should be made to achieve the balanced budget. These differences are very clear when it comes to the choice to strip people of their life savings to pay for health care for years to come. This is not the only important issue to go unmentioned in the government's throne speech. Despite discussing the need for economic growth in the throne speech, unbelievably, Mr. Speaker, this government did not even mention the island of Cape Breton. This government has alluded to, but never produced, a plan for the new Cape Breton economy. Listening to the speech from the throne, it has never been clearer that this government has no vision of Cape Breton's future. They have no plan to build opportunities so that the young people of the island can have a future in the place that they were born. The speech from the throne also contained no mention of youth, no mention of university students, of the desperate need for relief from ever-increasing tuition, no mention of programs to help young people stay in school or out of poverty. And there were issues in which the government mentioned but failed to take sufficient action, such as services for the disabled. While it is commendable that the government will waive the registration fee for handy van transportation, they have overlooked private vehicles adapted and marked for use by disabled drivers. And while the government mentioned recycled wheelchairs, they failed to mention other important aids for assisted living. They failed to address the need for coverage of wheelchairs under MSI. And let's not forget that this is the government that cut accessibility grants in 1999. This is the government that has ignored the needs of many in the disabled community, thumbing its nose at the Kendrick Report, promising but not delivering self-managed attendant care, failing families with autistic children, and cutting independent housing programs. The small commitments made in the throne speech do not go far enough to meet the need for government support that exists in the disabled community. The government has affirmed its pledge to restore low-income assistance for diabetics. It was scandalous, Mr. Speaker, that this program was eliminated in the first place. The NDP was also committed to bring it back. However, Mr. Speaker, the costs of pharmacare, a serious issue for many seniors and a hindrance to their good health, was not addressed. Accountability for the Romano money that Nova Scotia has already received and the plans for the promised implementation of other Romano recommendations, like the national catastrophic drug coverage, was not even mentioned. And one would not know, reading the speech from the throne, that DHAs continue to struggle with an annual budget crisis. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, the budgets of the DHAs have not even been released. While the province never seems to have a real plan to provide community-based care and health promotion that keeps people off waiting lists in the first place. Mr. Speaker, respect for healthcare workers is fundamental to a turnaround in our healthcare system, and those workers will be at the bargaining table this fall. We know, Mr. Speaker, that there won't be a repeat of Bill 68. But we have heard throughout the campaign from many, many nurses, paramedics, and other healthcare workers who are looking for respect and a genuine plan to improve both their working conditions and the patient care they provide. The government is fiddling with governance issues at the school board level. Yet parents and teachers will tell you that the focus has to be on our classrooms, where resources are needed so that children get the attention they deserve. I found very little confidence in the government's much publicized plans. So we will be looking to see if the new minister really believes that the Tories' pre-election publicity blitz is actually the best direction they can provide for the education system. The throne speech mentioned agriculture and the BSE crisis facing our province's agricultural producers. But this government has refused to extend federal BSE relief to struggling farmers. When the speech refers to more immediate relief, this is the only a reference to bridge funding to help farmers pay their share of the disaster relief contribution. This is not new aid, and it is not meaningful for beef producers. BSE relief started and ended too soon to help the majority of producers who have not yet taken their cattle to auction. The speech from the throne does mention, at some length, the issue of taxation. The government congratulates itself for starting to implement its promised income tax cut. It fails to point out, however, that the tax burden on Nova Scotians from taxes and user fees has increased dramatically over the past 4 years. Provincial government revenue is now $1 billion higher, and much of that higher revenue is coming from low and middle income Nova Scotians. People need a break, particularly people at the lower end of the income scale. I'm talking about the people on minimum wage, single parents struggling to make ends meet, spouses who are working from home and getting whatever part-time work is available, young people just starting out in the job market. They are all taxpayers. They pay tax every time they buy a good or a service, even if it's an essential like home heating fuel or children's medication. They pay higher taxes every time they put gasoline in their car, and regardless of their income level. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that most of these people need a car to get to work. The government claims that its tax scheme will give people a break, but it barely makes a dent in the total Tory tax increase, and the greatest benefit is, of course, delivered, Mr. Speaker, to those highest income earners. The NDP believes that it is the most unfair taxes that must be cut first. We believe the tax burden should be shared fairly by Nova Scotians, and I believe that is the tax issue of greatest concern and interest to most of the people of this province. Now, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned yesterday that in the throne speech, the government states its intention to give working families a break. And I must say that I am flattered that the government has chosen to borrow the language that the NDP used throughout the recent election campaign. Unfortunately, the government has chosen not to borrow any of the NDP's policies that would actually deliver the badly needed break to Nova Scotia families. Today, the NDP has tabled 3 bills that put forward real solutions to some of the most pressing issues in our province. We have introduced an act to provide for the elimination of the provincial harmonized sales tax on family essentials. This bill would give notice to the Government of Canada to terminate the existing HST agreement and appoint a commissioner who would report within 6 months on which family essentials would be exempt from tax. We introduced an amendment to the Homes for Special Care Act that would end the unfair practice of charging residents for health care in long-term care facilities. We have introduced an act to ensure the lowest and fairest rates for automobile insurance through the establishment of a public auto insurance corporation. These bills signal very clearly to Nova Scotians what the NDP's priorities are in the upcoming session. But you know something, Mr. Speaker? More importantly than that, they address the largest single flaw in the government's throne speech, its lack of vision. We offer instead, Mr. Speaker, a society that recognizes the inherent value of cooperative government, a cooperative commonwealth where the benefits of our society flow to all of its citizens without discriminatory exclusion. A government where the House bends to the will of the people for the benefit of the people. So we will be focusing on the issues we will put forward in the election campaign. The issues that matter most to today's families. The issues that underline the compassionate nature of the cooperative commonwealth. In all legislation, we will look for this vision of Nova Scotia. For example, will the 7-day work week legislation protect employees and businesses who now have to work those 7 days? For us, Mr. Speaker, the priority will be to ensure that the rights of working people are considered first and foremost as the 7-day work week becomes a reality. And that small businesses are not forced to stay open on Sundays. As I said earlier in my remarks, Mr. Speaker, all parties face the dilemma of reconciling their platforms and policies with the possibilities of this minority government. The NDP understands this. We stand by the platform on which we ran. We will look for every opportunity to advance and achieve a better deal for today's families, the better deal that we outlined over the course of the campaign. But we also know that real change is best achieved by realists. To that end, Mr. Speaker, I will not be seeking to amend the government's throne speech. I do this for the express purpose of demonstrating the willingness of this caucus to enter bona fide into the relationship of the minority government to achieve the ends that I have set out in this speech. But make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, that wherever the government fails, we will be its staunchest critic and its most ferocious opponent. I look forward to a productive session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise in this historic chamber to respond to the speech from the throne. First, I want to congratulate you, Mr. Speaker, for your resumption in the chair. I'm sure we'll appreciate your experienced and steady judgment as we move forward in this sitting of the House. My congratulations as well to the Lieutenant Governor, who continues to discharge her duties with dignity and skill. I especially applaud her efforts to celebrate the accomplishments of young Nova Scotians and to ensure that Government House is filled with the voices of young people more often. Congratulations to all the members who were successful in this last election, especially to the Premier, Dr. Ham, and to the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Dexter. I look forward to a constructive working relationship with them individually and with their parties. None of our three parties received a clear mandate. So our mandate is to work together, to find solutions, and explore and drive options which work for Nova Scotians first. I welcome all fellow rookies who joined me in the class of 2003 on this floor. This week has felt strangely like Frosh Week back at St. Avex about 24 years ago. I was even ID'd on my way into the House yesterday by one of the commissionaires. I felt as awkward in responding when I said to the commissionaire, I'm a member. But as I thought about that, I suspected that some in this room, would think in some respects I am in name only, until I go through the usual rites of passage with gaffes and stammers, as if I haven't had enough of those. I anticipate that my classmates will also go through that. They will have interesting times during this sitting and beyond. You will forgive me if I especially welcome the new Liberal MLAs who are with us today. The new member from Annapolis, who the member from Glace Bay insisted had to go to the back row because of his height. His neighbor, the member from Digby, Annapolis, and his other neighbor, the member from Kings West, the member from Halifax Clayton Park, and a special welcome to the returning member from Preston. I want to recognize the contribution of Liberal members who represented their constituents and Nova Scotians with honor for many years and who aren't with us today. It may have involved the commitment of Dr. Jim Smith, the tenacity of Don Down, the good nature of Kenny McCaskill, and what can we say about Paul McEwen? We can speak of his eloquence and his commitment to the people in his community. I also want to recognize the contribution of the members of the other parties who did not reoffer or who were not reelected. John Holm and Robert Chisholm of the NDP. Neil LeBlanc, Gordon Balser, Brian Boudreau, John Kerry, Frank Chipman, Tim Olive, Marianne McGraw, David Hensby, Muriel Bailey, and my predecessor, Jane Purvis in Halifax Citadel, whose hard work and forthright manner earned her the respect of many Nova Scotians. On behalf of our party and our caucus, I want also to pay tribute to one of our great Nova Scotians and one of the great leaders of our party, the late Premier John Savage. John Savage may have been best known as Premier, but he was and will continue to be, in our eyes, a humanitarian whose heart and skill and intellectual curiosity could encompass everything from community daycare to AIDS clinics in Africa or to Nova Scotian artists. We are a better place because he and his late wife, Margaret, chose to share their rich lives with us in Nova Scotia. To the people of Halifax Citadel, I offer my thanks for their confidence and my commitment to their issues and their concerns. Halifax Citadel, the constituency in which this building rests, has been in many ways the center of my life. I attended university and worked here, and today my family lives, plays, works, and learns in Halifax Citadel. All of us understand the role of our families, the role our families play in our ability to serve. I want to thank Sheila and our children and my large family for their unstinting support over the past 2 years. Perhaps only those of us who sit here can truly comprehend the sacrifice that our families make every day. I want to acknowledge also the contributions of the volunteers from every party, with a special salute to our outstanding volunteer team in Halifax Citadel, perhaps best exemplified by someone who's in our West Gallery who didn't know I was going to be referring to her today but is embarrassed at the mention of her name, June Hart, who's with us today. Mr. Speaker, someone of outstanding commitment, not just to Halifax Citadel, but to the people of Nova Scotia. Volunteers really are the core of electoral democracy, and their efforts, especially during a summer election, are remarkable. On behalf of the Liberal caucus, we pledge to honor the commitment these volunteers have shown to making Nova Scotia better. We in this House, in this chamber, make decisions and debate issues that are of real and abiding significance in the lives of Nova Scotians. Decisions that affect the quality of education our children receive, the amount of support seniors might receive, or the level of protection for our environment or for our most vulnerable Nova Scotians. This is one of the most sacred jobs in Nova Scotia, and for every moment of glory that we must have, there must be an hour of soul-searching as we seek to represent the best interests of Nova Scotians. The 52 men and women who were elected on August 5th join a very small group of people who have shared this honor, this trust, and this responsibility. Names like Uniacke, Howe, McDonald, Stanfield, Nicholson, Donahoe, McDonough, and Savage stand before us. It is their principles and their values that we must seek to apply to the issues of today. The fact is that issues may change, but values and principles don't. They are the bedrock of our society, and it is on that bedrock that we must stand. One of those values is the truth. There was some suggestion during the election that voters don't care about debt, Mr. Speaker. Well, they may not worry about it every day, and it may not be the top-of-mind issue. But Nova Scotians understand that the crushing public debt affects the way they live. It affects the availability of jobs, the quality of our education, and whether we have safer roads and timely access for patients. And Nova Scotians know when they are respected enough and trusted enough to hear the whole truth and to see the whole plan, Mr. Speaker. A week ago today, we heard from the Minister of Finance about new information about the financial woes of the province. This new information raises important questions. Today, 10,304 new $155 checks are being mailed out to Nova Scotians. Would Nova Scotians have chosen $155 checks in June if they had known it would mean unaffordable school fees in our public school system? Would they have chosen $155 checks over an end to the painfully frequent cancellation of surgeries in this province? Would they have chosen a $155 check over waiting times of 5 hours when they have chest pains that should have been attended to in 30 minutes? Would they have chosen $155 checks knowing it would mean that babies can't be delivered in some parts of this province on weekends? And would they have chosen $155 checks, or would they have wanted to put some of the gas tax into their deteriorating roads? We in this House must understand that part of our job is to offer Nova Scotians choices that are based on the plain choices. That offer is one of truth. It is time, perhaps, that we respected Nova Scotians enough to replace quick fixes with public policy that will restore excellence and affordability to our children's schools, to our health system, to the roads that lead to our homes and businesses. We are in a minority situation, Mr. Speaker, but that's no excuse for timidity when this hour demands boldness. When our students are receiving unacceptably low scores in national exams, when our people have low health scores, and when investment in this wonderful province is tentative. And Mr. Speaker, yesterday's speech from the throne is thin and timid, and itself is tentative, missing in strength and vision. Nova Scotians seek vision and leadership. They need to know their government understands the impact, for example, of the recent economic challenges in Canada. And they need the comfort that their government has the courage and the vision to minimize the impact of those challenges in their lives. But there is little comfort in the speech from the throne for Nova Scotians when it comes, for example, to seniors. Where are the seniors in this speech? Where are the university students? Where is the plan for community health centres from Blue Book 2? Where, indeed, is the promise from Blue Book 1 to put gas taxes into roads? Mr. Speaker, I want to assure Nova Scotians that the Liberal caucus is here to work in the best interests of Nova Scotians. And that means to cooperate with the other parties. And there are some opportunities for real cooperation in this speech. We are pleased to see the government moving in the direction of legislated reductions in automobile insurance rates. But we must maintain proper levels of compensation for car accident victims who have suffered meaningful injuries. The regulations tabled today should not comfort Nova Scotians. Nova Scotia accident victims deserve proper compensation, and it's not contained in the regulations that have been tabled today. We must also be conscious, however, that liability and property insurance rates are causing hardship for Nova Scotians, their businesses, and their communities. We also welcome the Ready to Learn initiative. We know that learning begins long before a child enters school. Any investment in early childhood will be recovered many times over as these children grow up. And we welcome the indications in this speech that government is ready to bring greater fairness to property assessment for Nova Scotians. But it's too early to get excited. We remain only hopeful. The Sunday shopping proposal, again, is a timid step in a direction that Nova Scotians simply want to go in. We will be seeking a stronger action to these issues, which is a simple matter of choice. that must include real and meaningful protections for workers. Mr. Speaker, cooperation does not mean compromise on matters of principle. It does not mean avoiding controversy or vigorous debate. Cooperation means bringing forward practical and workable alternatives and defending them assertively. It means listening to Nova Scotians and listening to each other as legislators, in committee, in the halls, and especially listening to each other in this chamber. This province has historically been the leader in this part of Canada economically, culturally, and politically. But today, we are passing to our youth one of the highest per capita debt loads in the country. There are three paths before us. There is the path of retreat, there is the path of standing still, and there is the path of moving forward, of honoring the spirit of the men and women who have tenaciously built this province and made us proud to be Blue-Nosers. We stand before the period of perhaps our greatest opportunity since Confederation, and we need to seize it. To do that, we must be clear, we must be bold, we must set a direction, and we must be guided in everything we do by that direction. In short, as the Leader of the Opposition suggested, we need a vision. The first hurdle is to get beyond our chronic financial mess. Yesterday, the member from Colchester-Musquodoboit spoke of the jobs created during the 4 years of the Conservative government. Mr. Speaker, the member should have also mentioned that this was the same number created in only 2 years of the McClellan government, and more of them were full-time. It's also noteworthy that the economic stimulation that the $155 was supposed to have created in Nova Scotia has coincided with an alarming increase in the unemployment rate in our province. So what have Nova Scotians received for the choices that government has made? Growing debt, another subject that was ignored in yesterday's speech. And the cupboards are nearly bare for seniors, students, patients, farmers, and families. I note with some interest the comments that the Leader of the Opposition made with respect to the 10% tax cut today. It was his party that sat on their hands and buttoned their lips, however, when they had an opportunity to speak directly to Nova Scotians during this past campaign about how this was going to hurt Nova Scotians. The cupboards may be bare, Mr. Speaker, because for seniors and students and patients, because the NDP remained silent when they knew the cuts were wrong. That's right. It is today's families who will not receive a better deal because of their support for this particular tax cut. What does it say about our priorities today that we spend more on interest on the debt than we do on educating our children? Shame. We spend less on government services than any other province in Canada. If we manage the debt, we will be able to focus on economic development and a healthy, employment-ready Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, today we are losing too many of our young Nova Scotians, not because they'd rather go down the road to Toronto, Boston, or Calgary, but because they can't afford to stay here. Even within this chamber, we will go home at the end of today to see treasured pictures on our walls or on our counters of loved ones, brothers and sisters, our children who have gone down the road to find work, to build communities, to raise families. We will see economic growth only when our young people know they can afford to stay in Nova Scotia to raise their own families. That is the trust we owe Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. But we do not see university students with their crushing debt mentioned in the throne speech. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to touch on the subject of health care. Nova Scotians want to know that they need to know that they will be diagnosed and cared for in a timely fashion. Meeting that target requires leadership and innovation. We don't have all the answers today, but we have known many of them for a long time. And we must finally drive the healthcare agenda more aggressively. That is the trust we owe Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And what about the seniors under yesterday's throne speech? There was a lot of brave talk about them during the election, but virtually nothing to show for it when the rubber hit the road. We've said for a long time that we are for fairness in long-term care facilities, but we also suggest that we stop thinking about seniors as a cost to society and begin to consider ways that we can work with them to extend their independence in their own homes. We hear from seniors who want to stay in their own homes, and they could if they could afford some minor repairs to their windows or the addition of a bathroom to the ground floor. The existing senior housing programs are oversubscribed and underfunded. This is the trust we owe Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.